So today I want to talk about one of the world's most powerful institutions and the fact that it is going insane. I'm talking about the U.S. Federal Court of the Southern District of New York and what it has done to a lawyer named Stephen Donziger. Now, this may seem like a boring U.S. constitutional issue, but I want to assure you that it is very relevant to your rights and privileges, no matter where in the world you may happen to live. You may not be interested in the SDNY, but the SDNY is interested in you. It's not immediately obvious that the federal courts of the Southern District of New York are one of the world's most powerful institutions. It's not even that obvious that it's one of the most powerful courts in the United States. The U.S. has at least two separate court systems. There are the various state and local systems that still handle the majority of criminal and civil matters in whatever manner each state feels is right. Then there is the federal system, which handles more and more of the matters that, matter. The federal courts have three levels, with the Supreme Court at the top, 13 circuit courts under it, and then under that, district courts for every jurisdiction of the Union. Some states have just one district court. New York is big enough that it has 4. New York City itself has 2, the Southern District for Manhattan and some suburbs, and the Eastern District for Brooklyn and the rest of Long Island. So why the heck would New York City courts be such a big deal? There's 2 levels of judges above them. Why would their decisions be so important? Well, the Southern District of New York happens to have New York City's main business district. This means that, along with Delaware, it's one of the most important courts for commercial disputes on the entire planet. And unlike Delaware, the Southern District of New York is also home to some of the richest people in the world, in a state that used to be the richest and most populous in the United States. New York's 160-year run as the country's largest state ended in 1970, but the city and its federal courts have held on to their prestige and their control of many of the country's most important issues. Over the past century, U.S. federal power has been growing and consolidating, and New York City's federal courts have been at the forefront of this process. From abortion and guns to education, the environment, civil rights, and so much more, the courts have taken over more and more of American life, and it has primarily been federal courts guiding that process. But again, why is this lower-level U.S. government court so important? It's because the SDNY is where the day-to-day business of national and world government actually happens. The Supreme Court is a collection of 9 geriatrics who all sit down together to discuss every case they take. 8,000 cases apply to be heard by the Supreme Court annually, but they only have the time to deal with like 60 to 80 of those cases. The Donziger case we will eventually discuss today wasn't decided by the Supreme Court. Last week, they simply decided not to hear it. 2 Supreme Court justices dissented against that decision, but it doesn't matter. Donziger is out of luck because the Supreme Court doesn't have the time to hear his case and thousands of others. The Southern District of New York, however, has a vastly larger bandwidth. It has 44 district judges and 15 magistrate judges that hear cases individually. They have hundreds, if not thousands, of legal professionals working for them, and they have tremendous power over not just the lives of the people in their courts, but over the development of international law everywhere. Now, this is where things get a bit weird. People often ask me how it was that I worked in Turkey with an American law degree. Well, if you live in a country that uses international money to fund building infrastructure, then the chances are pretty good that your bridges, tunnels, and shopping malls could be governed by the law of the Southern District of New York. Now, obviously, if you shoot someone on a bridge in Istanbul, that's an issue for the Turkish authorities. But if that bridge falls down and somebody has to be sued, Turkish plaintiffs may be forced to make their case in the Southern District of New York. The construction of every large project in the world is governed by contracts that are a couple hundred pages long and can include thousands of pages of supplemental documentation. And in those contracts, there is usually a single paragraph that specifies the governing law for disputes related to that contract. Almost every single project I worked on in 2 years in Turkey was governed by Swiss law, the laws of London or those of the Southern District of New York. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. The truth is that we already have world government. People often wonder why I'm so dismissive of theories about the BRICS or coming Chinese dominance. The power of the U.S. military is important, but that's just the blunt edge of the incredibly intrusive, deeply imperial power of the U.S.'s various court systems. The U.S. military has destroyed a handful of countries this century. The Southern District of New York makes laws for every country in the world. An example I've talked about before is the 2015 FIFA prosecutions. The U.S. still doesn't care much about soccer, is not the headquarters for the sports governing organizations, and was not the residence or nationality for many of the defendants. Yet New York City courts are where this globally significant prosecution happened. And people only notice because it was about soccer, something that people care about. New York courts deal with lower-profile, globally significant cases all the time. Sam Bankman-Fried, the alleged mastermind behind the international FTX fraud, is of course being tried in the Southern District of New York. A week or so back, it was announced that new charges would be added, alleging that he had bribed Chinese officials. Nobody thought it was strange that this Chinese crime would be prosecuted in a New York court. The case of Chevron and Stephen Donziger is another example. Donziger is the kind of crusading environmental lawyer that most first-year law students want to be, until they see their college debt bill and decide to go work for a large company like Chevron, the oil company that has spent the past decade destroying Stephen Donziger. This litigation started all the way back in 1993, when Donziger sued Texaco for the environmental catastrophe it had unleashed while drilling for oil in Ecuador from the 1960s to the 1990s. Even back then, the obvious jurisdiction for this case was the Southern District of New York. The case dragged on for years until Chevron, the oil company that bought Texaco, convinced a friendly New York judge that the case should be moved to Ecuador, where Chevron assumed they could easily overpower Donziger and his impoverished indigenous clients. This turned out to be a big mistake. From 2002 to 2011, Donziger and his team executed a multi-front public relations and litigation campaign that moved through all levels of Ecuadorian courts and ordered Chevron to pay $9 billion to the plaintiffs. It's probably not surprising that most of a decade later, Chevron has managed to avoid paying out much of any of that money. But the fact that it isn't surprising, or even really commented on much at all in this controversy, tells us a lot about how the world really works. I've read a lot of discussion of this case over the past few days, and nobody sees it as particularly surprising or even worth commenting on that the lowest level of U.S. federal courts seems to have the right to investigate, comment on, and discard the settled judgment of the highest court in Ecuador, in a case that concerns events and responsibilities exclusively related to Ecuador, whose jurisdiction Chevron agreed to accept. Some of the highest-priced lawyers in the world went over the Ecuadorian process with a fine-toothed comb and were able to find reasons to call the result corrupt and invalid. This isn't surprising. No U.S. state court would be able to stand up under that kind of scrutiny, and Ecuador's process has been easily discarded. What is surprising, and honestly kind of shocking, is the degree to which the SDNY has been willing to work with Chevron to destroy Donziger, the lawyer who had done so much to humiliate them in Ecuador. For the temerity of trashing them in the Ecuadorian courts they chose, Chevron has gotten Donziger disbarred, disgraced, and essentially forced out of business. Chevron won a variety of cases against him in the Southern District of New York that have left him with debts he can never pay, and absurdly legally forbidden from getting paid for working on the Ecuador case he won. Now this sure looks to me like a corporate Goliath punishing a legal hero by turning his life into a Kafkaesque nightmare. But that could just be my biases against the oil industry. Maybe the unethical stuff Donziger did went beyond what you need to do to win a fight this unbalanced, and he really does deserve to have his life and career utterly destroyed. Frankly, I don't have the spare months that would be necessary to research this case's decades-long history and make those kinds of determinations. But the destruction of Donziger's career and life isn't even the most outrageous part of the case. If the Southern District of New York had just left it there, they would have been shielded from scrutiny by the complexity of the case and by Chevron's public relations department. But that wasn't enough for them. The SDNY decided to come after this environmental lawyer's freedom as well. Donziger, quite understandably, hasn't been very cooperative with some of the judgments against him. You will note that Chevron has also avoided paying that $9 billion it was ordered to pay a solid decade ago now. But the SDNY wasn't content to let Donziger continue trying legal remedies. They wanted to throw him in jail for criminal contempt. The problem is that under the U.S. Constitution, you need to get the executive branch involved to deprive someone of their freedom. The Department of Justice looked at this mess and politely declined to prosecute Donziger the way the court wanted. So the Southern District of New York decided to appoint a bunch of Chevron-adjacent lawyers as prosecutors to convict Donziger and place him under house arrest. He spent almost 3 years in that condition. Unconstitutional behavior is usually a big hit in U.S. media. Every time the Tallahassee incest court breaks a norm or some Alabama school board bans a book, we end up hearing about it for weeks. But for some reason, nobody seems to be at all interested in one of the world's most powerful courts just deciding to give itself the right to incarcerate lawyers it doesn't like. The silence of mainstream media is all the more surprising when you consider how profoundly this move has troubled people across ideological lines. I probably learned the most about Donziger and his case from a leftist podcast called Chapo Trap House. Last week, they were joined as Donziger defenders by 2 Trump appointees to the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, who dissented against that court's choice not to hear the case. We can argue about whether Donziger went too far in his Ecuadorian fight against Chevron. But with supporters this diverse, there can be no doubt that the SDNY is out of control. It's too bad that we're spending all this time focused on Donziger rather than his poor indigenous clients who continue to suffer from the ravages of pollution. But the role of the attorney is very important. We already live in a world where U.S. courts control a shocking and growing number of things. U.S. courts can strip away Afghanistan's central bank, sanction anybody, and treat the decisions of the highest courts of other countries as if they were nothing more than toilet paper. In a world like this, aggressive U.S. attorneys like Stephen Donziger are really the last hope that non-U.S. people have. And now, even that is being stripped away. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And have I mentioned recently that I have an email list? If I lose access to any of these platforms, it will be the only way for me to reach my audience. Please do sign up, either at the link here or the link in the video description. Thanks.